Way back in 1864, about 158 years ago. Voters repealed it in 1914, then brought it back in 1920. Voters repealed it again in 1964, then brought it back in 1978. The state Supreme Court struck it down in 1981, then voters brought it back in 1984. Are you kind of seeing a pattern here? Oregon has executed 60 people since 1904. Despite the death penalty being current law, Governor John Kitzhaber issued a moratorium back in 2011, and Governor Kate Brown kept that policy over the past 7 years, blocking any executions. And now she has commuted, that means reduced the death sentence, for 17 inmates. As of today, their sentence is life in prison without parole. Some are pleased with the decision, including Frank Thompson, seen here wearing the tie. He's a former superintendent of prisons for Oregon. He served during the 1990s. He wrote, "This is a tremendous moment for me. I oversaw the construction of Oregon's death chamber, and I supervised the only 2 executions to take place in our state in the current death penalty era." He continued, "The death penalty is simply bad policy on many levels. It does a disservice to everyone it touches, including the state workers in our corrections department, whose job it is to carry out executions." Oregon Governor Kate Brown told me earlier this week in an interview that the Department of Corrections has now taken apart that death chamber at her direction. Another group cheering the governor's move is Oregon Justice Resource Center. It has a stated goal of frustrating and dismantling mass incarceration in Oregon. Executive Director Bobin Singh issued a statement that reads in part, "Capital punishment's racist origins in lynching and its continued discriminatory utilization are well documented. The line that connects the racial terrorism of white supremacy to the death penalty is unequivocal. The disproportionate usage of the death penalty against people of color, particularly black people, is a national source of shame from which Oregon is not immune." So, some strong feelings there. But what about the population in general? Well, a Pew Research Center survey in 2021 found that 60% of Americans strongly or somewhat favor the death penalty for convicted murderers. 64% said the death penalty is morally justified when someone has committed murder. Here's some other interesting findings. 56% believe black people are more likely than white people to be sentenced to death for committing similar crimes. 63% say the death penalty does not deter people from committing serious crimes. And 78% said there is some risk that an innocent person will be executed. Also, the Pew survey found a long-term decline in support for the death penalty nationally. 78% supported it back in 1996. By the year 2020, that was down to 52%. Finally, one last set of stats for you. As of July 2021, 27 states and the federal government have the death penalty on the books. But 13 of those, including Oregon, have not carried out an execution in more than a decade. Oregon's last execution, in fact, was in 1997. But executions are still happening elsewhere, including today. Just hours ago, Mississippi executed a man there for the rape and murder of a teenager. And one last stat. There were 2,570 people on death row at the end of 2019. I wanted to share all that data with you, both local and national, to help give you some context to the discussions and trends going on surrounding this issue. It also helps tee up the interview I did with Governor Kate Brown 2 days ago. In it, she talked about her decision to commute the sentences of those 17 people on Oregon's death row.
It is immoral. Justice is not served by the state taking a life. Secondly, its impact is inequitable, depending upon where you live in the state and in this country. And third, it doesn't make sense. It doesn't prevent violent crime, and it costs taxpayers thousands, millions of dollars. So this is the path that Oregon has been on for the last several years. The Oregon legislature passed Senate Bill 1013, substantially reducing the number of crimes that are eligible for the death penalty. And the third piece is that under my leadership, the Department of Corrections has dismantled death row. So at this point in time, it makes sense that we take this next step. I know that not everyone will agree with my decision, but I hope it is a further step towards finality in this conversation.
Yeah, there are, I think when there are votes, generally the general population supports the death penalty, but the leaders don't. How is this not thwarting the will of the people?
Well, what is really clear is that Oregonians have elected governors who have opposed the death penalty for the last 40 or 50 years. And that what is also clear is that the death penalty is not going to be used in Oregon. So I believe that there are many Oregonians that share my values, that it is inequitable, immoral, and doesn't make sense for the state to take a life, particularly when it is irreversible. And I think it's incredibly important that our actions match our values in this circumstance.
And so these people, they will spend the rest of their natural lives in prison, or will they get parole?
My commutations will lead to life without parole. These folks have committed horrific crimes. Let me be perfectly clear. They should spend the rest of their lives behind bars.
It might not surprise you that the governor's decision is drawing angry criticism from some. Tim Knopp, the Republican leader of Oregon's state Senate, issued a statement that reads in part, "Did the people of Oregon vote to end the death penalty? I don't recall that happening." This is another example, he writes, of the governor and the Democrats not abiding by the wishes of Oregonians. Even in the final days of her term, Brown continues to disrespect victims of the most violent crimes. And a viewer named Greg, who said he worked on one of the murder cases that the governor commuted, wrote, "So here we go again with Governor Brown and her personal agenda to literally burn the criminal justice system down. Her agenda from day one has been restorative justice. Where is the justice for the victims and their families?" The governor's order is no doubt devastating for some, if not all, the loved ones impacted by the people who are on Oregon's death row. The mayor of Woodburn, for example, issued a scathing statement ripping into the governor's commutations. Here's what it's about, by the way. 14 years ago this month, a father and son planted a bomb outside a bank in Woodburn, demanding money from the bank. Instead, investigators took the bomb inside the bank building and were working on it when it blew up. The blast killed Woodburn Police Captain Tom Tennant and Oregon State Police bomb tech William Hakeem. The police chief at the time, Scott Russell, was severely injured. The night after the blast, Woodburn's mayor at the time, Kathy Figley, shared the community's deep sadness.
We are here to make our pain a little better by sharing it, but also to direct our thoughts, our prayers, and our love toward two families that are in pain.
Bruce and Joshua Turner, father and son, were convicted in the deaths and given the death sentence. Now, like everyone else on death row, that sentence is changed to life without the possibility of parole. Woodburn's current mayor, Frank Longren, issued this statement in response today. "As mayor, I was shocked and angered to learn that Governor Brown unilaterally commuted the death sentence of the two murderers who committed these terrible crimes against our police officers and our community without consultation or apparent consideration of the victims." He noted that the Supreme Court had reviewed the case and upheld the convictions and the sentence. He continued, "Governor Brown's decision is an injustice to those who were affected by the bombing and a repudiation of Oregon voters who established the death penalty for those convicted of murdering innocent victims and police officers." And who could forget about this case? Christian Longo murdered his wife, Mary Jane, and their three children, Zachary, Sadie, and Madison, in Lincoln County back in 2003. He dumped their bodies in the ocean off the Oregon coast and then fled to Mexico. Today we heard from the sister of Mary Jane Longo, who is devastated that Christian would be spared from the death penalty. Penny Baker Dupuy got an unexpected phone call yesterday morning from a state employee with, quote, bad news. A lot of victims' families got this phone call. That's how she found out that Christian Longo would live out his days in prison and that she would get no say in the matter. It was already a done deal.
This isn't someone receiving a sentence unjustly that may be innocent. This is someone that deserves to die for what they've done. If anyone deserves to die for their crime, it is Chris. Before this happened, I did not have an opinion on the death penalty. I did not feel that that was my decision to make about anyone. After this happened, I have an opinion on the death penalty. Chris deserves to be dead for what he did. My family will never feel safe until Chris is no longer a part of this world. He has done so much damage and continues to do damage, and he's been behind bars for 20 years. There is a reason that that jury convicted him to death, and he deserves it.
Dubé argues that Governor Brown should have consulted with families affected by the commutations, saying that many are left devastated by the fact that so much was taken from them only for a death sentence to be wiped away with the stroke of a pen.
I think she needs to see some pictures and some videos of the lives that were lost.
For many, the death penalty comes down to a moral consideration. Is it right for the government to take someone's life even if they did something terrible? Most of you probably have an opinion on that. But let's set aside the personal opinions for just a moment and consider the cold, hard numbers. Which costs more, imprisoning someone for life or executing them? A study from a few years ago at Lewis and Clark College shows that in Oregon, the death penalty is significantly more expensive. The studies from 2016, it found that aggravated murder cases where prosecutors go for and get the death penalty cost much more than aggravated murder cases where prosecutors do not ask for the death penalty. The death sentences handed down in Oregon cost taxpayers an average of about $2.3 million. The non-death penalty aggravated murder cases cost about $1.4 million. And if you take jail costs out and look at just how much it costs these cases to go through the system, well, it's an even bigger difference. Death penalty cases cost about $1.4 million. That's the bar on the left there. Life sentences, the next bar over, and other sentences cost way less, not even $500,000 each. So why is it so much more expensive? Well, it has to do with Oregon's law. Oregon's Constitution requires a lengthy process of court proceedings and appeals in these death penalty cases. In an aggravated murder case, a defendant cannot waive their right to trial by jury unless they plead guilty. And a jury trial costs more money. Defendants are required to have an attorney who has a special certification in death penalty cases, and that costs more money. Aggravated murder cases include 2 trials, the first for the jury to decide whether someone's guilty, and if so, then the second part where it goes to the penalty trial. In that trial, the jury has a lot of work to do. They have to determine whether the murder was deliberate, whether the defendant posed a continuing threat to society, whether the defendant's acts were unreasonable in response to provocation, and whether the defendant should get the death sentence. In order for the death penalty to be assigned, all the jurors have to agree on all 4 factors. So that can be a long and expensive process. But it's still not over, even after the penalty trial. After a jury hands down a death sentence, the case automatically goes to the Oregon Supreme Court for review. The defendant can also continue to appeal the ruling to the Oregon Court of Appeals, the Oregon Supreme Court, the Federal District Court, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, even the U.S. Supreme Court. The appeals process, as you can tell, can go on for a long, long time. And all of those appeals and hearings and court filings, they add to the cost. So, with all that in mind, and we have covered a lot here tonight, the cost of executions, the death penalty process, the impact on victims' families, and the governor's defense of her decision, what about you? Where do you land on this? You can let us know. Our contact info is there on the screen. You can send an email to thestory@kgw.com or leave us a voicemail. The phone number is 503-226-5090. And it doesn't matter if you're watching this live or playing it back later. We do care what you have to say, and we really do read your comments and listen to your messages. Still to come on The Story. People often bemoan certain rules or regulations of a neighborhood association or homeowners association. But for decades, some rules were not aimed at where you could put a fence. It was about who could live there in the first place.
This land shall never be occupied, sold, or given to Negroes or any person or persons of the Negro blood.
Lawmakers in Washington state have set money aside now to allow researchers to find these racist covenants. And if you're trying to guess how many they've found so far, I can tell you the number is higher than you think. The full report when The Story returns. It's against the law to have a whites-only neighborhood. That's pretty obvious. But that kind of racist language is actually still on the books in thousands of Western Washington neighborhoods. The words, phrases, and racist names can be difficult to read and hear, but state lawmakers recently set aside $250,000 for researchers to go ferret those out. Drew Mickelson with our sister station in Seattle has the story.
Live somewhere scenic and charming. Established in 1930, Seattle's Lake Ridge neighborhood, advertised as the most outstanding single residential development in all the Northwest. A place where today, the neighborhood hasn't changed much, even 100 years later.
I can't live in this area.
George Carter plays in a regular pickup pickleball game at the Lake Ridge playfield.
Oh my God.
So does Nicholas Wynn. They love living in this part of Seattle, but that would not have been possible when this area was developed.
Said lots or lots shall not be sold, nor rented or leased to any person not of the white race.
Wow.
Nor shall any person not of the white race be permitted to occupy any lots.
Wow.
This land shall never be occupied, sold, or given to Negroes or any person or persons of the Negro blood. Not of the white race be permitted to occupy any portion except a domestic servant.
Okay, I can be a butler.
For decades, so-called restrictive or protective homeowner agreements, sometimes detailed in the fine print, but not always hidden, were outlawed in the 1960s. They are not enforceable today, but they remain on the books.
I'm angry. I don't know about you.
I don't feel very good about it. I grew up in the South, so not too much surprised me.
Born in Mississippi, Carter, now 78, will never forget Jim Crow laws.
You can't drink out their fountain, and you can't go to their bathroom, or you can't sit, you buy your food, go to the restaurant, you go to the back door and buy your food.
You remember that?
Oh yes, I grew up with it.
The retired Seattle firefighter moved to the Northwest, hoping he'd be treated better.
I don't even think they have something like this in Mississippi.
These racial restrictive covenants were used as a tool of segregation.
Graduate students from the University of Washington and Eastern Washington University are heading up a state-funded project to examine homeowner agreements and neighborhood restrictions, looking for racist language. Like the Bellevue development originally sold only to members of the Aryan race, or a section in the heart of Capitol Hill prohibiting residents of Negro blood.
Something you find today might end up as a dot on this map.
There are so many documents to go through. The students are training volunteers, extra sets of eyes, to help sift through the old records.
I just found one, two actually.
Rachel Brown at Seattle's Davis Wright Tremaine law firm.
This contract is not assignable to any Asiatic or colored person without the written consent of the vendors.
Is one of the 600 volunteers helping expose secrets of the Northwest's past.
It's incredibly difficult to really see, systemic racism playing out in these documents that are in front of me on my screen.
The official practice of segregation promoted by the federal government, state governments, that's part of our history as much as it's part of Mississippi's history.
University of Washington history professor James Gregory started the research in 2005. Since then, his students and volunteers have found more than 25,000 properties with racial restrictions in Western Washington so far.
Most of the records are still on microfilm, and that's hard. That takes eyeballs and hours of looking through reels and reels of microfilm for these restrictions. So we're a long way from finishing with some counties.
The state funding runs out next summer. Professor Gregory says he plans on returning to Olympia to try to get the project fully funded. The bill's original sponsor, Representative Javier Valdez, says this work is long overdue, and he will push to get additional funding when lawmakers return here next January.
We owe it to our fellow citizens not to waltz through life ignorant about inequalities that still matter. That come from history but still matter.
We can't forget our past.
George Carter could not have lived in the place he calls home today. That angers him, but he says it's not surprising. All his life, whether in the South or the Northwest, he's felt like he was on the outside looking in.
People up here, they camouflage it. People in the South, they don't. That's the difference. You know where you stand. Up here, people laugh in your face and stab you in the back.
As Drew Mickelson reporting. Still to come on the story. From coniferous to deciduous and everything in between, trees are a vital part of the Pacific Northwest landscape, but a new study around Portland shows they could also be vital to humans as well, and not just because they create oxygen for us to breathe. After this next story, you'll either take a deep breath of thanks or roll your eyes as you wonder why people study certain things. When the story returns. The Pacific Northwest is known for its gorgeous trees, from the massive firs that cover our mountains to the maples and alders that line our streets. But new researchers are shedding fresh light on the health beneath our leafy neighbors. And it goes far beyond the capture of carbon dioxide and the release of oxygen through photosynthesis. Remember learning that in grade school? Environmental reporter Cale Williams has our story.
We've long known the benefits of trees. They provide great cooling effects. They cut air pollution. They raise property values. And they just look good. But new research has found another potential benefit. Those trees you see planted along the sidewalk, they might just be saving lives. Jeffrey Donovan, a researcher with the USDA Forest Service, first started thinking about the relationship between trees and deaths years ago, after he did a study that found
places that had lost more trees also saw more people die. What I wondered was, is the opposite also true? That is, if we planted more trees, would we see fewer people die?
To figure that out, Donovan needed data. He was able to get neighborhood-level mortality data from the Oregon Health Authority. For tree data, he turned to Friends of Trees, a Portland-based nonprofit that has facilitated the planting of roughly 50,000 trees in the city since 1990. Then he used statistical modeling to start looking for trends.
You're just looking for patterns. You're looking for where things move together or where they move in opposite directions. So in this case, things moved in opposite directions. More trees, fewer deaths.
He accounted for other factors that could impact mortality, like race, income, and education level. And still,
even after accounting for that, we still saw this pattern emerging. Where in neighborhoods where more trees had been planted, we saw fewer deaths.
Donovan's findings were striking.
In total, we estimate that trees planted by Friends of Trees are associated with about 15 fewer deaths a year in Portland.
He was careful to note the difference between correlation and causation, though.
We found this correlation. We did not find that more trees cause fewer deaths, but we do think it's likely that trees are saving lives in Portland because we accounted for a lot of other possible explanations.
Ultimately, Donovan's biggest takeaway was that the benefit of a tree vastly outweighs the cost of planting it.
We estimate that the benefit-cost ratio was over 1,000 to 1, which is, preposterous. It's the type of thing you get in your email scams or something like that.
Cale Williams, KGW News.
Well, that's the end of our show. Thanks for watching and being here. Remember, the story, our story, well, that never ends. I'll see you tomorrow.
This is KGW News at 6.